My purpose this morning is really to share with you some of our insights and even some of our decision processes. We were thinking about where to build a plant and where we were putting our footprint around the world. Now, when we were thinking about this building back in the mid-2000s, I think starting around 2005, 2006, of course it was a very different time. Most U.S. manufacturers were looking at overseas production. Hypertherm actually exports over 60% of its production around the world, so we have a very diversified global footprint, but 98, 99% of our production is here in the Upper Valley of New Hampshire and Vermont. But we saw a lot of trends going elsewhere, and a lot of our growth as a company was in fact coming from China and Brazil during that time. And so we were examining what was going on, what kind of decisions were other companies making, how are we going to be thinking about this? What you see around you here is over a $50 million investment, and what kind of bet was that? This was a real moment of truth. And in fact, at the time, this was the cover, sort of roughly the end of 2004. This was the cover of Business Week. So it reads the 3 scariest words in U.S. industry, the China price. And the subtext here is cut your price at least 30% or lose your customers. Nearly every manufacturer is vulnerable. And then here there's this little subtext down here that things are so bad that maybe we have to rethink the free trade model. If we can't compete, we maybe have to change some of the rules. So this was obviously on people's minds. In fact, here in the Upper Valley, sometimes called Plasma Valley, because thermodynamics and Hypertherm and then many of the consumable producers ended up in this area, and a lot of the technology was born from the Thayer School of Engineering at Dartmouth, along with Creari, which a number of faculty members started, and from which Dick founded Hypertherm. So a kind of a real question about what was going on. Today, just 3 weeks ago, in Time magazine, the cover looked like this: Made in the USA. Manufacturing is back, but where are the jobs? That'll be an important point that we'll talk to. But this is just what I want to explore today, is a little bit of a setup for your time, your day and a half at Hypertherm. What's 2004, 2013, was this ever real? How real is this? What's driving some of these dynamics? And what influence do we have over some of the key levers that are going to make either one or the other of these true? So in a quick outline, I just wanted to talk through a little bit around fact and fiction on U.S. manufacturing decline. I think that's pretty conventionally accepted among the broader population, that U.S. manufacturing has been and perhaps continues to be in decline. Talk a little bit about the manufacturing renaissance. This was a term that was largely coined just 2-3 years ago. Again, fact versus fiction, or those people who are publishing that term or advancing it, what's behind that. Then we'll just quickly touch on the key issues for the U.S. manufacturers. What influence do we have over these trends? And if there's choices that we have to make that will either cause success or failure, what are those choices? What do we have to address? And then finally, given that, what are our strategies? What's Hypertherm doing? What might we advocate in this room and during this day and a half to be sharing as strategies for success in U.S. manufacturing? So to start with a decline, most commonly people associate the decline in U.S. manufacturing with employment. So this graph, the blue line, simply shows the peak around 1977 of about 19.5 million workers in U.S. manufacturing. You can see as you follow that line that it kind of bumped along, was in decline since 1977, but really hit the skids around 2000 with the recession and fell all the way to about 12 million. So about a 40% drop in U.S. manufacturing population in that time. Went from 22% of the non-farm payroll in the U.S. down to 9%. That's often, well, the second big piece that people often cite is just the declining role of manufacturing in the U.S. economy. So from a peak in around the 1950s of about 28% of the U.S. economy, manufacturing fell to about, it's still around 11% today. So more than a halving of the role of manufacturing in the U.S. economy. And that's often juxtaposed or contrasted with the rise of the service economy in the U.S., represented by the red line here. So the acronym here, FIRE, or finance, insurance, real estate, and manufacturing. And you see it's rising as the role of manufacturing is dropping. Well, we take those two together. So a 40% drop in manufacturing employment in the U.S. and more than a halving of the role of manufacturing in the U.S. economy. Surely what happened with manufacturing output over that time surely must have just dropped. No, in fact, industrial production more than tripled during that same time period. So, in fact, let's put those two graphs together on the screen at once here. Manufacturing jobs, red line, down 40%. Manufacturing output over the same time period, more than doubled. So what's the missing ingredient? Well, productivity, of course. And here you see productivity. The average productivity of the U.S. worker in that same time period actually tripled. So really the conventional wisdom that manufacturing has been on the skids or has largely been exiting the U.S. is just not true based on the output numbers. Of course, what is true is that it has been a declining part of the economy and that it has had an adverse effect on employment in the manufacturing sector. But let's explore that further. Okay, people will say, but isn't it true that the U.S. has lost its leadership position in global manufacturing? Well, this graph just shows total manufacturing output, the broadest definition, which includes mining and utilities. And in fact, the U.S. has maintained its #1 position. You do see China here in the red line rising rapidly, but the United States has held on to a leadership position throughout this period. It is true that if you narrow it down just to stuff being manufactured, so you take out mining and you take out energy production, that around now and around 2010 into 2011, China modestly overtook the U.S., but we both represent today about 20% of global manufacturing production. Now, the big distinction is that to make its 20%, China uses about 100 to 110 million manufacturing workers. For the U.S., to make its 20%, uses about 11.5 million people. So 100, 110 million versus 11.5 million. So roughly a tenfold productivity difference between the populations. The other conventional wisdom is that we've outsourced pretty much everything. Everything that we use today is largely made overseas. Well, that's true in parts of the economy. This graph is a little bit complicated, but more or less everything other than this dark green shade is imported product. And across the bottom here, we have different product categories. And over here on the far right, you know, the things that we see most often when we go into Target or Walmart buying clothing, apparel, shoes, and so forth. It is true, more than 90% of that product category comes from overseas. But you can see by the width of that bar, which represents the percent of the total economy or the total consumption in the U.S., that represents a very small piece of the overall consumption basket in the U.S. As you move to the left, you get computers and electronics. Again, when we go into Best Buy and so forth, again, we often see made in China or made in other countries. And that too has a majority of product being imported. But the more that you go to the left, the more value in the products, the more that's still made in the U.S. And if you added up the total area, the dark green area, we still have more than 75% of our consumption is supplied right here in the U.S. by U.S. manufacturers. Now, let's come back quickly to this percent of GDP. You know, in the red line here again is the U.S. and the decline of the role of manufacturing in the total economy. But you see the blue line, which is the world, the total world. And in fact, the same thing is happening universally around the globe. And it's not too different than if you think about agriculture at the turn of the century, so from 1899 into the early 1900s. Actually, as a percent of our consumption, food represented 45% of our pocketbook. Today, it represents about 13%. So as productivity rises, as manufacturing technology, in that case agricultural technology, advances, it consumes less of our pocketbook, and we have more discretionary spending to do other things. So it's productivity phenomenon that we're talking about. And the services, there's nothing per se wrong with an economy that generates wealth through services. But the fact is that when we see a decline like this, what it really represents is the people using more of their discretionary money as their needs for goods are satisfied. More of discretionary spending goes into travel, entertainment, healthcare, financial services, insurance, and so forth. And in fact, the ultimate measure of standards of living in any economy, of course, are real GDP per capita. And that measure here in the US has been pretty much, the dark spot here is the Great Depression. And of course, we have the dip from the Great Recession just emerging in this graph at the end. But it's been a pretty relentless move upwards. So the question then would be, so what's the issue then? If we're not necessarily in decline in the output of manufacturing, and the decline in manufacturing as a percent of the economy just reflects high productivity and rising living standards and discretionary spending on services, what's the issue? Well, there are a few things that academics sort of mull about and that pundits debate on TV and in the press. One is represented by this graph on the upper right. And this graph just shows the change in median income over time. And you can see the blue line there is a reproduction of that productivity line that I showed in an earlier graph. Productivity relentlessly moving up. But you see around 1977, or around that time where we started seeing the decline in manufacturing employment, that the median income, shown by the red line, actually flattened out. So there's at least one theory that says that as employment shifts from manufacturing to services, you lose the ticket into the middle class life. That in services, typically you have knowledge workers, highly educated, and then there's not too much in between there to fast food service, for instance. And so that the median income, not necessarily the average income, but the middle of society no longer has that sort of UAW car manufacturer high dollar opportunity to enter the middle class with a high school education. The other key points are that manufacturing has a higher multiplier effect. So for every dollar of manufacturing GDP, you get about $1.42 in non-manufacturing. Those are support services, the infrastructures that spring up around factories, and again, the spending multiplier effect of those manufacturing wages and so forth. Also, one manufacturing job, just expressed in the employment multiplier effect, one manufacturing job typically equals 3 more in logistics, transportation, and construction. The final point is that manufacturing companies represent close to 70% of private sector R&D investment. So if you think it matters in the economy who's advancing new technologies and developing them, manufacturing them, and harvesting the premiums that come from new technologies coming out into the market, then it matters where manufacturing is happening, because that's also where the R&D is happening and where you gain the differentiation. All right, so hopefully we've separated fact from fiction on the decline of manufacturing, or gained a more nuanced understanding of it. Next would be manufacturing renaissance. Now, this term was when I first talked a year ago, this term was relatively fresh. You were seeing it a little bit The Washington Post, the Boston Consulting Group was publishing papers about what they were predicting as a manufacturing renaissance in the US. And Boston Consulting Group probably had the main, produced the main paper that was the catalyst for a lot of this discussion. And their main points here, and I'll just quickly summarize, they said, this was in 2010, 2011, that by 2015, manufacturing in China will only be 10 to 15% cheaper than in the US, even before inventory and shipping costs are considered. And then as they were talking with manufacturers, they said more than a third of the surveyed respondents plan to or are actively considering bringing work home from China. So what was going on there? Well, one thing was that what we have been observing over the last decade or more is that Chinese wages, even though exceedingly low to start with, and even today, have been increasing at a rate about 15 to 20% per year, regularly. Now today, the Chinese average wage is still anywhere from 4 to 7 times lower than the US worker. But with labor only representing about 20% of the cost of products, you can see how that move, plus a productivity advantage, we talked about a current productivity advantage of around 10 times, and even if you model that the US worker holds on to about a 3 times productivity advantage, that's what produces this number here of the gap narrowing to about 10 to 15% in production cost, even before you have to ship that product over from China. And so their prediction was that, especially as they spoke with manufacturers who had accumulated some experience manufacturing in places like China, was the real-life experiences they were having with quality management concerns, with extended supply chains and the headaches of extra inventory and of change, customers wanting to change their mix and being stuck with the inventory that you have in pipeline, the intellectual property risks of how you're protected when you're operating in that market, and the increasing emergence of incentives right here in the US for manufacturers to build plants and to make investments. And this is a more recent article that just came out in December of last year, 2012, in The Atlantic, and it talked about GE's experience. In Louisville, GE had kind of this appliance park, just a huge, if you've seen Caterpillar plants, more or less this was a combination of a number of buildings that made up something equivalent to those miles-long Caterpillar plants where they're making appliances up until around the 1980s or so. And all of that got moved overseas, mostly to China. And in fact, GE attempted to sell the property and were unable to. And as they began to see some of these phenomena of the narrowing of costs, they began re-examining, well, maybe there's some things, we have this property, the conditions have changed in the US, we see some of these disadvantages. Maybe we ought to start exploring some products that we could be making in the US instead of China. And a key one was a high technology, Aqua, I'm forgetting the exact brand name, but a new water heater that they wanted to explore bringing back from China. And in fact, when they wanted to cost that out, they had this big epiphany, that had been about 20 years where just on pure labor cost calculations, they had shipped this overseas, but they kept doing the designs here in the US, but manufacturing over in China. And what they discovered was that over this 20-year time period, this product had become miserably difficult to manufacture. So these guys over in the US were designing things on paper, shipping them over, getting a quote from their Chinese manufacturing location. Seemed good, must still be a lot lower, and they kept doing this. But when they actually brought it back and had their team evaluate it for manufacture in the US, they said, we can't make this. This is, all this copper tubing and the brazing required. Boy, not only are we going to have a hard time producing a quality product, but it's going to be really expensive. So they went about, normal team fashion, looking at it and doing some iterative designs. They took out about 25% just by basic manufacturing for design analysis. They took out 1 out of every 5 parts. They took out 25% of the material content. And they took the labor content down from 10 hours to 2. So this product that they had been making in China and selling in the U.S., they turned out they could actually make it in the U.S., sell it for less, and make more profit in the end. And that's what they've been doing. One of my favorite parts of the tour of this building, I don't know if you'll get it emphasized or not, is when you get further down into the manual equipment team area, our manual systems business, you can actually stand at a certain angle and you'll be looking over the marketing guys here who have all the products laid out and brochures and different new product ideas. You look right over the manufacturing, engineering area, the operations and procurement guys intermingled with the manufacturer, with the engineers. You can look through the glass, see the production area right behind them, and if you stand just at the right angle, you can see the actual development labs behind the production area. So this is a very tight team that's constantly comparing notes and thinking about how to improve the quality of the product together, drive out costs through value engineering, but ultimately preserve design performance and the differentiation and do it right here very competitively. So I hope y'all have a chance to experience that. The other things contributing to the more favorable environment, for better or worse in the U.S., is that our labor force has become more competitive. Manufacturing labor costs from 2005 to the first quarter of 2012 are actually down about 3% over that time period. And I say for better and worse. This is some of that earlier chart about median income. But certainly it creates more employment opportunities here in the U.S. Wages are back to where they were in 2000, adjusted for inflation. And union membership, which peaked out around 40% in the 1940s, is down to less than 8% today. The other fact I think everybody here is intimate with now, this is newer news back in the middle of 2012, end of 2011, is the effect of the energy revolution here in the U.S. The prediction now that the U.S. will actually be the #1 producer of oil in the world, surpassing Saudi Arabia around 2020. And just the continuous innovation here. Now there's only about 10% of U.S. manufacturing that has more than about 5% of its cost base in energy costs. So it's not going to sort of wholesale transform everything that we do, but certainly in the industries that we're in, feeding the oil investment, the steel, the piping, the fracking tanks, and so forth, it's a significant driver. Certainly for key industry sectors, steel making, petrochemical, ethylene plants, and so forth, it's a major advantage, and we see plants springing up and being built back in the U.S. And on the whole, it does represent about $1 billion per day in U.S. industry competitive advantage. You see the price here of 1 million BTU of natural gas in the U.S. compared to Japan, Europe, and the UK. And even China is about 4 to 5 times higher cost in natural gas than the U.S. So what evidence have we had so far of a manufacturing renaissance? Well, it's difficult to say. It's still early. Certainly you saw in that earlier graph that I showed that there has been an uptick in manufacturing employment. Now, is that just a cyclical rebound, or is there some promise in that? It is the first increase since 1997, or over 16 years, first increase in manufacturing employment since that time. We have seen in the U.S. that manufacturing employment has grown faster since the recession than in any other developed country. We've got, since the bottom of the recession, we had about, this was through the end of 2011, we had about 3.2% growth in manufacturing jobs versus about 1.5% overall. And as I said, it's been the first rise since 1997. So some, at least maybe a staunching of the bleeding, though I think the jury's still out here. The other thing that we see is some beginning, you see smatterings of it in the press of high-profile companies beginning to make incremental decisions to build new capacity here rather than overseas. And in some certain cases even to be reshoring business. This graphic over here, I know most of you can't see it, but it basically just depicts the industry sectors that are most likely to be considering reshoring, or certainly building their incremental capacity here in the US rather than overseas. On the bottom right are those things with relatively lower labor content, high value, lower sort of total volume. Those products never left US shores and are unlikely to leave. The upper left here are those with high labor content, high volumes, lower value. Those are likely never to come back, apparel and certain things. But you have a whole middle swath here where, as this phenomenon continues to develop and the cost difference narrows and other factors take over in the balance of considerations, that could be up for grabs. And for our purposes, we look at things like fabricated metals, machinery, transportation goods, all in the heart of what we do and what you do here in the room. So some important promise areas. So key issues for US manufacturers. Doesn't sound like it's a done deal, certainly supportive conditions, but what are the key issues that US manufacturers are facing and maybe trying to take advantage of this situation or to be part of the trend? I've listed 4 here. I'm really only going to talk to 2 very quickly. Skills gap, uncertainty, volatility, forward risks, domestic supply base and infrastructure, taxes and regulation. There's certainly more, but those are an important big 4 that from hearing CEOs talk are kind of weighing still on their decisions, even if factors are more favorable for US manufacturing decisions, still thinking hard about some of these constraints that they're experiencing. Since I won't be covering it very quickly, when you look at the factory here, and we have another facility up the street that does printed circuit boards, but that's been a key challenge area for Hypertherm in recent years. New England used to be the hotbed of the computer industry, and so we had a lot of electronic component suppliers, printed circuit board fabricators, and that really has been hollowed out. Since my time at Hypertherm, I actually was a business team leader on manual systems for a period, and I just remember that always being a headache, these printed circuit board producers going in and out of bankruptcy, and it's just now very difficult. That now is a capability that we have to ourselves have in-house, or have to hope to attain a certain scale where we can leverage some of these larger global electronic manufacturing suppliers. The skills gap. This is under some dispute. Anything that comes out as a paper within the next year or 2, somebody comes out and says it's bunk. But this particular study had a fair amount of impact. Again, towards the end of 2011, Deloitte and the Manufacturing Institute put out a study that said that 67% of US manufacturers that they surveyed are reporting moderate to severe shortages of qualified workers. And their calculation from that was that as many as 600,000 skilled positions are going unfilled, even as we have an unemployment rate, in that time period that was still hovering around 8%, and an underemployment rate around 14 or 15% in the economy. We had 600,000 openings by their estimation that were going unfilled for lack of qualified workers. 74% of the surveyed respondents said that that's having a significant impact on their ability to expand operations and improve their productivity. And key categories, this strikes right at our heart: machinists, operators, craft workers, technicians. So these skilled roles now that are more and more difficult. And a lot of those skills that exist in the workforce today are retiring. And so the issue is expected to only get worse in the next 3 to 5 years or more. So this is a key issue, clearly, for, I think, your customers, for us, for our customers, our shared customers, and so forth. And combined, the other factor clearly is this, you read it in the press constantly, that, okay, we have some good signs in the economy here and there, We've had like 3 or 4 spring stalls in a row where things look fairly good in the first quarter, but there are some warning signs, or Cyprus or natural disasters that knock, the earthquake in Japan that knock people off their game or off their confidence, and so it's a very fragile environment. And the World Bank warns of years of volatility as economies, as governments deleverage, as certain developing economies rebalance their economies for sustainability. And you just have decision makers in business treading very carefully and just looking, keeping their powder dry generally. And you combine those 2 factors, so the skills gap, the difficulty of filling roles, and the fact that people are uncertain about making commitments to people. Nobody, even for all the reputation of the U.S., nobody likes to hire people just to lay them off a year later. So what we've seen as a phenomenon in the industry is a clear movement towards increased automation. So since, from the bottom in 2009 to more or less when the recession was declared over, we know we continue to bump along at a very low rates, but through that time period, spending on equipment software was up 31%, even while private sector hiring was below 1.5 points. So U.S. is now the second only to Japan in the use of industrialized robots. And if you've ever been in Japan in production environments, they're in love with robots. So that's really saying something here in the U.S. And there's a lot of evidence that we're just into the 3rd industrial revolution, whether that was first people moving from agrarian environments into mills, and then ultimately from mills into the Henry Ford production line, and now into technology-driven manufacturing. And so this is a key trend, obviously one that we invest in, both in our facility but also in the products and the technologies that we seek to bring to customers and partners. So finally, strategies for success. One quick caveat before we go into this and presume success too much is that, since I gave the presentation a year ago, as I said, the term manufacturing renaissance was a relatively new one, hadn't been scrutinized all that much, was sort of picking up a fair amount of buzz. But since then, there are a lot of naysayers, a lot of legitimate doubters. And here I just kind of put up, myth of the manufacturing renaissance. Is it real? There's no real evidence of the revival. Signs of the revival are hard to spot. Sorry, manufacturing isn't coming back. The shale gas boom isn't all that it's been built up to be. And there are some important warnings. Basically what people are saying is, hey, if you look in the numbers, we ought to be seeing it in increased export competitiveness, and we're not really yet. We ought to be seeing it in energy-sensitive industries, really growing rapidly, and there's no real evidence of that yet. We ought to be seeing it in building momentum in manufacturing employment, and we're not really. It sort of grew by 500,000, has stalled out more recently. We ought to see it in the net development of new production facilities, and we're not really yet in the U.S. So, I think it just, obviously it's awfully early. Remember, the prediction was by 2015, it's still a couple of years away that we'd be within 10 to 15%. It's an awfully volatile, uncertain global economic environment, so people aren't making a lot of bets either way at this point. So I think that my takeaway is that the jury is still out. But I guess the good news is that none of these writers or analysts are suggesting that the downslide is continuing. Basically, the unsaid premise in all of them is that, the bleeding has stopped, and in fact, the environment is more conducive. We're just not seeing hard evidence yet that things are coming from that. And I think our takeaway is that, this clearly was Chicken Little in 2004. But nothing is inevitable. This too could be Pollyanna, that a lot of what actually happens over the next decade is not sort of preordained. It's going to be what we're doing and the conditions that we're setting and what decision makers are doing and players in the industry are doing to affect the outcomes. And As a supplier to North American manufacturers, when we have 10 business units at Hypertherm, and we go, starting in the summer, we go into planning, and we try to kick them off with some key themes. And certainly key themes going into 2013 planning and continuing when we talk with our business unit managers is that, well, for one, you do need, evidence is sufficient that you need to view North America as a growth market. If you view it as a mature or a market in decline, that's somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And you need to be viewing it as an opportunity because there are significant opportunities out there and relatively strong demands for things like automation. And what are the problems that you're looking, any effective business effort or plan is around what customer problems you're trying to solve. So how are we helping manufacturers address the skilled labor gap? Maybe that's through products that require less training or education and are more integrated. Maybe it means providing a service where we really provide a differentiated training capability to our partners. Satisfy the automation and productivity demands. There clearly, we see what's driving that, and there's a lot of hunger for that. Deliver the continuous productivity improvement throughout the service life. So customers aren't just, customers are paranoid now. They're not just looking to buy a product and make a good decision today and revisit it 10 or 15 years later. They're looking to continuously improve under competitive forces. And if you can do that during the life cycle rather than just elephant hunting, there's a key opportunity there. Adapt to the volatile market and operating environments. We know we have these ups and downs, so we have to have a mix of products and services that help respond to a changing set of problems in any given quarter or year. And to the extent that there are gaps in the infrastructures, I talked about the printed circuit board supply base for Hypertherm. How do we as partners to customers actually create those infrastructures, actually provide those infrastructures, and maybe add it to our business model if it doesn't exist today. And certainly for Hypertherm, where we're propelled by that developing market growth in what I call the Goldilocks period where the whole world was growing. If now we have more ups and downs in different markets, a more volatile environment, that's also the key to our own success, how we're generating incremental value and revenue in a more even or uneven and volatile economic environment, what we call the new normal. And finally here, as a North American manufacturer, our own decisions about our own viability as a company that just invested $50-some million here in the facility that you're sitting in, what do we have to do to be successful, to be competitive? One is certainly the collaborative workforce development. I talked about that with the GE example and our manual systems. And how do we get absolutely the most out of that? How are we the most responsive, the most nimble, the most innovative, the most teaming manufacturer in the world right here in the Upper Valley? How do we foster that innovation ecosystem, not just in our four walls, but also with partners in the broader community, certainly in workforce development and academia and so forth? How do we drive relentless improvements in our productivity? If we're trying to be a great productivity tool provider and partner to our customers, it's best if we're doing that ourselves and know those disciplines and are able to incorporate those into our customer insights and product insights. We have to build strong supply and distribution infrastructures and partnerships. Again, we can't do it on our own, and we have to be very effective advocates and partners in building up that environment. And then one, this is a softer one, but an important one. I think, over those 20 years or so, especially where business began to be associated with corporate raiders and private equity and restructuring and on all those things, are basically financial manipulation, was that business has come to be viewed in many quarters in the U.S. and around the world as succeeding at the expense of society, rather than exceeding to the benefit of society. And certainly if we're creating enhanced technology and creating employment opportunities and a healthy tax base and a place for people to build their families around with a stable employment opportunity, you know, that should be something that we are investing with our partners in the community, and where we see that as you know, value creation together and how we're working to build the overall ecosystem and the overall environment and employment environment for our communities. So that's vitally important. And finally, you know, Hypertherm, you know, we're celebrating this facility here today, and a lot of the emphasis in this facility is training and development, certainly customer training and development and partner training and development. But you know, another facility and effort that we've been exceedingly proud of is our effort to develop our own workforce. And we have yet other facilities, certainly all our facilities are designed to promote that. But we have yet other facilities up the road that represent a multi-million-dollar investment in dedicated machinery and training staff. And you'll see machine operators out here, trained CNC, advanced CNC machine operators. That is the manufacturing worker of today. And we developed a public-private partnership and hired, you know, purchased the equipment, built the staff. And today we bring in most of our machine operators through our own Hypertherm Technology Training Institute through a 9-week course. You know, we're testing for aptitude, very frequently getting people who are either unemployed or underemployed in different parts of the local economy, paying them while they're getting their education, giving them, after they complete that, which is a very rigorous, you know, not all make it through, providing an apprenticeship sort of environment on the floor to bring them in, always trying to work in the cultural elements that are so important for us for that innovation ecosystem. But you have to be committed to that. And so we're certainly committed, you know, to U.S. manufacturing. We talked about that China price and the built in the USA. We certainly want to see the built in the U.S. slide be the true one and not to be Pollyanna. And we hope today that as you make your way around the building and get to know our people better, that you'll share in those convictions and that we'll have an opportunity to partner with you even closer to make this a reality. So I think we have a little bit of time left over, about 5-10 minutes or so, for any discussion or questions. I know it's a large group to foster that. Chris?
So what's one of the bigger challenges that you face today?
Well, I think for us it still is workforce development is a key issue for us. And I talked just about the machine operators, but increasingly now our technician, for instance, our technician workforce. You know, so we're having to take the next step in some regards and looking for college partnerships, or maybe even contemplating our own internal curriculum to create the test technicians and the lab technicians, and you know, the technical leadership group within the company. That's probably our most prominent one today. I mean, certainly when we talk with our congressional delegates, you know, the things that we're highlighting are workforce development. They also have to do with, you know, I think basic what we call STEM, or science, technology, engineering, and math in the curriculum, so that our schools are producing the students with the capabilities that we need. We talk a lot about intellectual property protection, you know, around the world, so that what we invent here, that we have a fair chance to protect. We're advocates of free trade, and so promoting that, you know, with free trade agreements, because we think we have the means to compete and we have the advantages here. So those are the types of things that we talk about as a U.S. manufacturer that still require the right kind of support from our partners in government and also in the broader private sector. Yes?
You talked a lot about the manufacturing history and needs of the manufacturing process. Do you see limitations in the sales channel?
Yeah, well, I think I think increasingly what we find is that, I mean, you talked about the sales channel, and I view that as kind of a continuous value stream, being our own sales organization through our channel partners, even into the end user. And I think the biggest challenge that we have is also on the technical side, being able to recruit and develop capable, value-added advisors, consultants who have, that kind of consultative mindset and skill set, but also a very firm technical grounding to understand the customer applications and what can be delivered. And I think we all share that challenge in staffing our organizations with that kind of talent. We're working very hard at it. Part of our Technical Training Institute is designed for those purposes. Part of what we're investing in here and the types of the parts of our sales organization that we're building are really focused in that area. But I see that as the biggest constraint. Certainly when you get overseas, that's even more so in spades. But in this environment, with a heavy emphasis on automation and productivity, I think that's a key bottleneck, sort of a skills, capability, resource bottleneck. But, yes?
I think it's pretty clear that you guys, believe in, building America, and you're making large investment. And you mentioned that there are obviously naysayers. There's some doubters out there. You don't impress me as one of them, but what do you think the growth is going to be here in the United States over the next, let's say 5 to 10 years? And are there any specific industries that you?
Boy, that's a. I always say I have to go to the men's room right now. I think the fundamentals are certainly in place for, it is a mature economy overall, and we're likely, given the next 5, 10 years, the need to deleverage certainly the government, even parts of the private sector, that we are likely looking at more suppressed growth, 2 to 3%, but I'm guessing, and I just sort of read and interpolate what others are putting out there. I think in our sector, in our industry, there's very definitely, we talked about not really seeing the evidence yet, but I think so much, those things happen in my own business experience, those things only happen with incremental decisions over time. You can only see it in retrospect with the patterns of decisions that built up over time as people began to see what others are doing and begin to imitate it and emulate it. And I think the fundamentals in place here are for potentially for a 1 or 2 point premium, so 4 or 5% industrial production growth in the U.S., so exceeding the general economy. And I do think it's likely to be in those areas. We're not necessarily going to see reshoring from overseas. I tend to sort of know how we think about, we never put plants overseas, but you're not going to sort of, businesses just don't overnight say suddenly I've got a plant in China and I'm going to close it. It's too much of a headache, I'm going to close it and bring it back. But it's likely to be that those plants will convert to Chinese demand rather than global demand, and that you'll see a rebalancing of capacity and corporate investments to match where their customer bases are, rather than kind of a global workshop, low cost.
Greater demand in America, and we're going to fulfill that?
I think there will be greater demand, and I think on the increment, on the marginal demand, that more of that will be fulfilled by U.S. producers. I do, yeah. Yes.
Where do you see, since '77, you were talking about employment on manufacturing had gone down, but productivity had continued to go up?
Yeah.
Do you feel that productivity has got to a point that it can't go much more? And when you start to go from where $80,000 per employee to $250,000 per employee from '77 to now, how much farther can that productivity rate go without having to continue to bring more people into manufacturing?
Yeah, I mean, part of that, of course, is what people decide to keep and make in the U.S., which tend to be those higher value, high technology products. And I don't have a great answer for exactly how much higher productivity can go, but I know, the human race, generally has been underestimated. You know, even the shale oil that we talked about, you know, it wasn't that long ago that people were talking about peak oil, or, you know, copper is just going to, you know, skyrocket in price forever and ever. And it's just, you know, the creative powers of innovation and technology and market forces are really quite remarkable. And people have just kind of made, you know, anybody who prognosticates about that kind of thing gets a good, you know, book opportunity and sells a couple million copies, but are almost inevitably proven wrong. Certainly the application of internet technology, you know, the next wave, I would say is probably still quite early in its total application in industry, even in U.S. industry. So you know, I don't know, I'd be guessing, but I don't see any reason why productivity won't triple again in the next 15, 20 years. Anybody else? Yes.
How about challenges from China in your key product groups?
Well, you know, our biggest, you know, it'll be very interesting to see, because of course China is trying to move away from a purely export and investment-driven economy. And, you know, a lot of what we're talking about here, 15, 20%, has actually been something the government in China has been driving. So they kind of see the future that they have to allow a middle class to develop, or they're going to lose their power. You know, they have something like 15 million people per year coming into the cities looking for gainful employment and an increase in their lifestyle. And so the government there, to the extent that, you know, I mean, that's probably the most important asterisk, because anytime a government tries to drive something consciously, it almost always, you know, has unintended consequences or forces that overtake it. But certainly they're trying to drive things into higher value industry and support their companies in doing that, and universities investing in spaces. And in our space, we've certainly seen that. For whatever reason, you know, the actual plasma equipment is not terribly easy just to knock off or to copy. So we've certainly seen that in the market in China, but nothing that's sort of risen yet to the level of outright competitive. But, you know, we have to remain paranoid and assume that will happen. Where we've really seen a very aggressive attack is on the consumables. In fact, we've just been talking in the last week about counterfeiting, the sophistication of counterfeiting. So this isn't just, you know, people providing Hypertherm consumables under a generic brand or their own, but actually as Hypertherm. And, you know, for a while there, we kind of laughed at it a little bit. You'd see the labels and they'd be misspelled, and the Hypertherm would look funny and the wrong color and everything else. You know, we've gotten to the point where we have, you're going to have to help me, Gordon. It's, you know, we have overt, covert, and forensic. So you get your overt things that we think are hard for the counterfeiters to reproduce. And we can share that with our partners and customers so they can help detect counterfeit with us. Covert are things that we think, well, you know, just in case they can reproduce it, we'll hide it someplace so it's hard to notice, so they won't reproduce it. And then forensic is where you get into special chemistry inks that literally they probably can't produce unless they go back to the original supplier here in the US. And we have, you know, these $200 detectors that you can hold up against the ink. And they have knocked off absolutely everything except the forensics at this point. Just remarkable, the sophistication. And so a lot of, you know, what we hope to be sharing in the next year or so are, you know, that so far that's just marking the consumables or the packaging. And what we've really been driving for, what we've set, you know, we might have a chance to talk about this, those of you who are in the strategy session, is just to change the consumable technology in a way that adds a great deal of performance value to customers, but is in something that simply cannot be copied or replicated at all. And we're going to have to be trying to accelerate and shifting that at the same time as we continue to increase our sophistication and battling, you know, working with internet partners who knock the sites down quickly, and you know, intellectual property enforcement and all the tools that we have at hand. Yeah.
It's not really a question. It's more a comment or observation that, and I'm sure there's got to be people in here that understand what I want to say, but over the last 20 years, watching Hypertherm, which goes back more than that, but you could see it, you could just see it gaining in its superiority to products and such. In the last 10 years, it just exploded, and the gap is widening. And luckily, I've been able to be involved in a few things in conversation at different times, and I'm always impressed, and I sincerely mean this, how your company has gained so much confidence. There was a time when the people in this organization, that the people out there, didn't even realize how far ahead they were in the world. And this last 10 years, this confidence is built, but the humility in the supplier is something that's rare, at least for me, with our suppliers. The humility that your company has maintained without arrogance and big-headedness is extremely enjoyable. And your growth and your taking over the world, basically, it is something that you never talk about. And it's absolutely seen, and I totally appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
I agree with it, it's certainly highlighted. I'm sure most of the people in here do business with the competition out there, and then seeing the recent purchase of ITT Group by Lincoln and the drastic changes that they put forth in a short period of time highlights that.
Well, we made sure you two guys are seated there. I'm glad the checks arrived in the mail before you came here. Yeah. But thank you. That's maybe a good segue, right? But thank you very much. Appreciate it.